2013 meeting of the Network of Christian Apologists in Calgary. We have a bit of a treat here tonight. We've got Stephen Bedard, who's joining us all the way from Ontario somewhere. Is that right, Stephen?
That's right.
Where in Ontario, just out of curiosity?
Cambridge.
Cambridge, excellent. Okay, well, Stephen's going to be giving us a little presentation on exposing the Jesus myth, and we look forward to what he's got to say. So, yeah, I'll let you have at her, Stephen. It's all yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's great to be here, so to speak. I wish I was there in person, but that's not possible right at the moment. But just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I am involved in apologetics in a number of ways. I have a ministry called Hope's Reason, and you can find out more information at our webpage, hopesreason.com, and they're involved in preparing materials for the local church, trying to equip Christians to be confident in their faith, and it's something very interesting. And also included in that is a apologetics journal, and of course I have a blog as well and a podcast, and all that information can be found at that site. I'm also an Army Padre in the reserves, which is a lot of fun. I really enjoy doing that. It's very rewarding. I teach at Emmanuel Bible College in Kitchener, which is right near Cambridge where I live, and also Tyndale University College. And in both of those I teach mainly New Testament, but I'll be teaching apologetics at Emmanuel next year, and I'm looking forward to that. I am also a student at Acadia Divinity College, and if anyone is looking to do some studies, I would encourage Acadia, especially in terms of their Doctor of Ministry program, which is what I'm involved in, and they are actually working on having an apologetics focus there, and they have some great people, including Craig Evans, a very good New Testament scholar, historical Jesus scholar, and I would certainly encourage that. I write, and I actually have an article in the most recent Faith Today, if anyone's interested, looking at limits of freedom of expression. And I enjoy speaking, and most important part of my role is that of husband and father. I have 5 children, ages 12 and under, and I am certainly a blessed man in that way, and certainly very thankful for all that God has brought my way. And part of why I want to do apologetics is to even prepare my family, prepare my children to be ready for the criticisms that I know will come their way. And I want to encourage them as they come to know Jesus and as they eventually grow in faith. And I want to do the same for other Christians as well. And that's my purpose, my mission in life, is to help in discipleship and to see Christians who are confident in their faith and willing to move forward and to do what God has called them to do. So we're going to look at the Jesus myth tonight, and I'll explain why I'm interested in that in a moment. But I am involved in a group, a Facebook group, of people who are primarily believers in the Christ myth. And so I put it out there to them saying I wanted some of them to explain what they believe, because it'd be really easy for me to put forward a straw man for you, that I could just make up something really easy that I could knock down, and we would all have a wonderful time together, and yet we wouldn't get even close to what people actually believe. And so I didn't want to do that, and so I told them exactly what I was doing. I told them that I was going to be teaching on this, and they were more than happy to share some thoughts, and I'm just going to share a couple of them with you. And this is what one person says with regard to the Jesus myth. It looks at the idea of Jesus, who, even if based initially on a real man, is largely a mythical figure. We consider early Christianity in its historical context, exploring its early influences such as Hellenistic Judaism and the mystery religions. Finally, we evaluate the probability of the Jesus presented to us in the Gospels being historic against the probability of this Jesus being mythical, and ultimately find the latter more likely. I think that's a very good definition of what the Jesus myth is. And one more that was presented, Jesus of Nazareth either never existed or else he is based on a man whose actual life bears little to no resemblance to the gospel story. And so there's a very short definition of the Jesus myth. Now, a lot of people will believe that this whole Jesus myth idea is sort of an internet sensation, and that's really where it's known these days, and yet it actually has been around for quite a while. And one of the people on that Christ myth group that I'm a part of, when I asked them what they would like you to hear, what he wanted you to know is that this has been around for a while. And here's just a list of some scholars who have accepted this and have promoted this in various ways. And that's not to say each of these scholars had the exact same view of the Jesus myth, but they were people who were influential and at least accepted some aspect of it. And some of them are major players in terms of New Testament scholarship. David Strauss would be one, and Bruno Bauer would be another. One of the interesting things here is Arthur Drews, which is there near the end, the second last in the list. When he wrote his book on the Jesus myth, Karl Barth, who was perhaps the most influential theologian of the 20th century, when he read that book, he almost accepted the Jesus myth. He was very intrigued by it and thought that there might be something to it. And so for someone of the caliber of Karl Barth to be tempted to accept the Jesus myth tells us that it is more than just some little fad. And this is something that is a challenge for people dealing with the Jesus myth, because most scholars today will just dismiss it and say that it's not even worth talking about, it's not even worth addressing. And yet there are many people out there who are buying into this and are waiting for someone to respond. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to do. Well, those are some examples of scholars of the past who have taught the Jesus myth, but most people today would know of it on a more popular level. And probably the most well-known example is that of the Da Vinci Code. And in Dan Brown's novel, he presents a form of the Jesus myth. Now, he accepts in that, of course, Jesus as a historical person, because he has him marrying Mary Magdalene and having children and having all kinds of descendants. But within the Da Vinci Code, he does promote the idea that the form of Jesus that we have in the Gospels is basically made up from different parts of different pagan myths, including Mithra and some Egyptian myths and from some other places as well. And so that was a very influential book, and even though people went into it knowing that it was a work of fiction, that it was a novel, many people bought into it. And I remember talking with one pastor who sat down and went through all of the historical details to demonstrate the errors of what Dan Brown presents in the Da Vinci Code, and the person said, well, I like the Da Vinci Code version of Jesus better. And so that's one of the challenges that we have. Some of this is not just on an intellectual level, it's on an emotional level as well. So the Da Vinci Code was very influential. Now the Zeitgeist movie is a bit different. It certainly is not as well known as the Da Vinci Code, and yet on the internet it has been influential in its own way. In fact, the way I encountered it is I had a couple of people from different areas of my life contact me, and these people were both, I would say, on the fringe of the church, that they had grown up in church but really were not actively attending church, and had the basics of what Christianity was about, but I wouldn't say that they were living a a vibrant Christian life. And both of these people separately contacted me and asked me what I thought about the Zeitgeist movie. They had encountered it, and they heard the claims that were found within it, and they found them quite compelling, and so they wanted to know what I had to say. And the Zeitgeist movie, it is very painful to watch. If you have seen it, it's very difficult to watch. I believe there's 3 different conspiracy theories going on within the movie, and only one of those 3 has to deal with Jesus. And in that part, it's arguing that indeed there's no evidence that Jesus existed and that he was based upon these pagan myths. And some of the painful things in it include the idea that Jesus is a sun god, and we know that he's a sun god because we can see hints of that when the New Testament calls him the Son of God, and that's a throwback to him being a sun god. Now, I'm not sure that they realize that the Bible was not written in English, and S-U-N and S-O-N. There's a problem there, and yet, you know what? We laugh at that, and I laughed at it. I couldn't believe that I was seeing it, and yet for people who have who haven't really thought deeply about these things, perhaps those people who are on the fringe of the church, they're like, wow, yeah, Son of God, Sun God, yeah, I can see how that works, and people buy into it, and so it has been very influential on its own level. And I actually respond in detail to this in one of the issues of our journal, Hope's Reason Journal, and that's at apologeticsjournal.com. And it's in our first volume. And basically what I did, I couldn't really bring myself to respond to the movie exactly, but there was a study guide that was written to go along with it by one of these Jesus myth scholars, and so I respond to her book because that was the most that I could bring myself to do, and even then it was very difficult to try to apply it because the claims were so wild. But those are just 2 ways in which, on a popular level, the Jesus myth has impacted people. Now, one of the things that's often brought up is that there's not many scholars out there who are accepting this. And so I've been saying scholars, but I really should be putting quotation marks around that, because most often the people who are arguing for this really are not active in the scholarly world. Some of them in the past have had PhDs, but most often not in PhDs related to their field. And so there's one influential author. He had a PhD, but his PhD was in German. And so, yes, I'm sure he knew a lot about German literature, but how that fits with looking at Egyptology and Hellenistic religion and New Testament and early Christian history, I'm not really sure. And there was another one who had a PhD in Theosophy, which is a cult from a number of years back and is still around in a number of forms. But one of the few people who does have recognized credentials is that of Robert Price. And this is what he says: "There may have been a Jesus on earth in the past, but the state of evidence is so ambiguous that we can never be sure what this figure was like, or indeed whether or not there was such a person." And just to give you a sense of where Robert Price is coming from and his influence, when one of the 4 View books was put out on the historical Jesus, they actually gave Robert Price one of the 4 views, and he argued for the mythicist perspective. And so we see that position is getting a bit more of a voice. Now, I'm not going to be responding specifically to him, but one of the other scholars of today who has some recognized credentials and is making some waves in this area is Richard Carrier. And he has talked a lot about this, and he's been having a little bit of a feud with Bart Ehrman, who is himself not a by no means a Christian, and yet has argued for the historical Jesus. And so it's been interesting to watch how that's played out. But that's just to give you a little bit of an idea of where the Jesus myth is coming from. Now, how did I get involved in this? Well, I actually got involved in this through my role as a pastor. And I was a pastor for 9 years in Meaford, Ontario. And Meaford's a little town about 2 hours away from where I am now. And as I was pastoring there, a number of people had begun to get concerned about Tom Harper, who is a well-known religion writer. He's written for a number of newspapers and has been influential on the Canadian religion scene for quite a long time. He is a former Anglican priest, and he used to teach at Wycliffe College in Toronto many years ago. And for a long time, he was definitely on the liberal side of things, and yet still held to a basic historical Jesus, including the resurrection. He believed in the physical resurrection of Jesus. However, after reading a couple of authors who really seemed to convince him that there wasn't a Jesus and that the pagan origins made sense, he began to change his role. And those two authors are Gerald Massey and Alvin Boyd Kuhn. And Kuhn is actually the PhD in theosophy that I was telling you about. And so Tom Harper began to be speaking these views and wrote a best-selling book, The Pagan Christ. And for a Canadian religion author to write a bestseller, and he sold an awful lot of books here, that tells us that there is an interest in this, that people were interested in what he had to say. Now, Tom Harper has a very interesting take on the Jesus myth. A lot of the people that are out there, people like Robert Price and Richard Carrier, are coming from an atheist background. That's really the worldview that they're arguing from. And Tom Harper is by no means an atheist. He definitely believes in God. However, as I read some of his earlier books to try to get a handle on where he was coming from, I could see that he was really struggling with certain things. And one of the things he was struggling with was the exclusivity of Christianity. In fact, in one of his books, For Christ's Sake, that's one of the earlier books he wrote on Jesus, he talks about the passage in John where Jesus says that he is the only way to the Father. And basically he argues that verse by itself is really responsible for the Crusades and the Inquisition and the Holocaust and all those other things that happen. And it's that kind of exclusive identity of Christianity and this attitude that we have towards people of different faiths that has caused so much damage in the world. And so I could see that he was really struggling with that. And when he encountered this Jesus myth idea, it really seemed to open up something new to him. So what he embraces is something called a cosmic Christ. And what that is instead of having a Jesus Christ as a historical figure from 2,000 years ago, every single one of us has this cosmic Christ inside us. And what we read in the Gospels is sort of an allegory of what happens inside of us. And so there's a virgin birth that takes place inside of us, and there's persecution that happens, and there's crucifixion, and there's a resurrection, a rebirth, and all of these other things. It's just a symbol of what happens within us. And for Tom Harper, that really made a difference for him, because then as a Christian, he doesn't look at a Muslim or a Hindu or a Buddhist or an atheist as being outside of the church, because that Muslim and Buddhist and atheist, they all have a cosmic Christ within them. Whether they know it or not, whether they would want to call it that or not, they have that cosmic Christ. And so that's really where he was coming from. And so this was something that people were very upset about. And I remember one person in my church asking, where are the clergy? Why aren't they responding? And so it worked out that I was studying at McMaster Divinity College in Hamilton at the time, and I was taking a course with Stanley Porter, who is the president of the college and also a New Testament professor, and began to talk to him about that. And we had some interesting conversations, and he had actually originally had never even heard of Tom Harper. However, the next time we met, we found out that that Stan had been contacted to debate Tom Harper on the air on a radio program, and he got the call Friday night and had to read The Pagan Christ Friday night and then debate Tom Harper Saturday morning. And so the next time we met, he goes, "Now I know what you're talking about." And so I put forward to Stan, why don't we do something? Why don't we write a book and respond to this? And so that's how we came up with Unmasking the Pagan Christ. And it was a great opportunity to go through and to look at the evidence for the historical Jesus and the potential connections with pagan myths. And I think it's actually a pretty good book. And I don't mean that just because I'm a co-author there. I think it's a good entry-level book looking at this. And even though we're responding specifically to Tom Harper, I think for those interested in general with the Jesus myth, they'll get the basic ideas that they need, and the resources are there to respond to this, even if the person they're talking to might never have heard of Tom Harper. They'll get the basic idea here, and so I think it is a very good resource, and it was actually made into a documentary as well, and it gets played on Vision TV every Easter time, and so you can have an opportunity to see that. So let's get right into it as to how we respond to this. And so the first question we might want to ask is, was there a historical Jesus? That's what we want to ask. Well, when we're asking that, what we really need to be asking is, what kind of evidence would we expect if there was a Jesus? And so we'll just use our imagination and we'll just say, yeah, there was a Jesus there. If that's the case, what kind of evidence would make it down to us now? And so we would expect his followers to write something about him. It just would make sense. If Jesus was who he said he was, if he was making as much of an impact on the people around him as we get a sense, we would think that his followers would write something. They would share some of his messages, some of his activities. That's the kind of stuff that we would expect to come down to us. We would perhaps expect Josephus, the Jewish historian of the first century, to write something of him. Now, we wouldn't expect him to write a lot because Josephus was not a Christian. He was Jewish, and not only that, he wasn't writing a history of the Jews just for the sake of writing a history of the Jews. He really was an apologist to the Romans. He was trying to express to the Romans, excuse me, he was trying to express to the Romans the value of the Jewish people and why they should be treated fairly, even though they lost the Jewish war. And so that's really the context in which he's writing. So he's sharing the struggles that the Jews are having in the first century, and he's talking a lot about the people who were claiming to be messiahs and who were leading groups of people in different areas. We see that in Josephus, so we would expect that Josephus would mention something about Jesus. Maybe not a lot, but he should mention something. So the next question we should ask, after we've asked what kind of evidence would we expect, we should ask what kind of evidence would we not expect. And so we would not expect much from Roman historians. Now, if you've studied much about the historical Jesus and have read books like Evidence That Demands a Verdict and other books like that, you'll find that they present the Roman evidence for Jesus. And we include that, and we look at that in our book, Unmasking the Pagan Christ. However, in my discussions with Jesus mythicists, I usually don't talk about the Roman historians, because I actually find that they are the weakest link. And the reason for that is when you look at what they're actually saying, they're really more acknowledging the presence of Christians at that time. And they mention Jesus, but it's not necessarily independent evidence that Jesus existed. All they're really saying is that there's these bunch of Christians who are going around saying that they follow a Jesus, or they follow a Christ, or a Christus, or a Crestus, or however they describe him. But that could really just be hearsay. It could just be the Roman historians acknowledging that Christians are talking about this individual. It's not the same as having a Roman historian observing what Jesus was doing and writing about him during that time. And we don't have that, and we wouldn't expect a Roman historian to write about Jesus at that time, because there would be no reason for them to do that. If you look at what Roman historians were writing about, they were not interested in what Jewish religious leaders were doing or saying. They really did not care. It was not important to them. They might talk about the Jewish people. They might talk about Judea. They might talk about some of the political things that were happening. But even that was fairly limited. They were more interested in the conflicts that were happening within Rome, the leadership struggles that were going on, the wars that took place, the rebellions that were put down. Those are the kind of things that the Roman historians were into. They were not interested in debates about Jewish theology, so we really shouldn't expect much in that area. We also should not expect anything from Philo, and this is something that comes up a lot. People say, well, why didn't Philo write something about him? After all, he was a contemporary of Jesus and lived a little bit past Jesus, and he wrote a lot. We have quite a few of his writings, so why wouldn't Philo write about Jesus? Well, Philo wasn't all that interested in what was happening in Israel, what was happening in Galilee or Judea. He lived in Alexandria in Egypt, and we know that he did visit Jerusalem, but he really did not spend much time there, and we don't know how much he was aware of what was happening at the time there. But even so, he was just not interested. Philo does not write history. He writes philosophy. Basically what he does, he takes Platonic philosophy and he tries to demonstrate how that fits with the Old Testament, how we can look at the book of Moses and see that Moses is compatible with Plato. That's basically the idea that Philo's putting forward. There is really no purpose for him to mention Jesus. Even if he knew about Jesus, there would be no reason for him to include anything. A lot of times I will hear people say, well, the people who were supposedly hearing Jesus preach or observing the miracles, they should have written something, and we should have those records. Well, you know what? We should not expect anything from the average people. The literacy rate back then was relatively low. Now, sometimes people make it extremely low, and it's probably not as low as some people say, but it's still, compared to today, was relatively low. And it's not like people sat around and blogged and wrote in their personal diaries. Today I went to the supermarket, and then I went to the synagogue, and after the synagogue I went and I saw Jesus Christ feed 5,000 people. Like, we don't have those kinds of records. And so most people weren't doing that. And if people did, and there probably were some people who wrote, a few notes about it. Maybe they wrote a letter to their cousin, sending a little some information about what they heard Jesus say. We should not expect that stuff to survive and come to us. Really, very little from the first century has actually survived. People point at the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Dead Sea Scrolls are really the exception that prove the rule. We sometimes forget how amazing it is that we would have the Dead Sea Scrolls, that those documents would survive today. And it's only because of where they were at in the Dead Sea caves that they were able to survive, where it's extremely dry. But in places like Jerusalem and much of Judea and in Galilee, we think of it as being desert, but it actually is fairly moist. And so if those documents were buried in a building somewhere and were just left there for however long, they would just rot away. They would just disappear. There's absolutely no reason for us to expect that any of those things would survive. And so we need to be aware of that and not expect those kind of things. Well, one of the questions we might ask is, what about the rabbis? What about the Jewish leaders of the time? We know that Jesus had Jewish opponents, and we would love to see what they had to say. I think it would be so exciting if there was an archaeological discovery and we found a load of letters by Pharisees and Sadducees responding to what Jesus had been teaching. That would be so exciting for us to have, and we would love to see something like that. But it is very unlikely that would ever take place, because right now we actually have no rabbinic writings from the first century. In fact, when Jewish scholars are trying to understand what Judaism looked like in the first century, one of the primary documents that they use is the New Testament, because that's where we find a lot of the stuff that they're interested in, and it's one of our best documents. In fact, the earliest document that we have that mentions Pharisees is that of the New Testament. We don't have anything before that talking about Pharisees. And so we shouldn't expect that we would have a first century writing responding to Jesus. And so I've been talking with some Jesus mythicists lately, and that's one of the things they hold out, that they will not believe in Jesus unless they see some kind of document by one of the opponents. But the fact is that those writings don't exist. Not just about Jesus, we just don't have those rabbinic writings at all. Now, of course, we do have the Mishnah and the Talmud, and they're from later. The Mishnah was written about 200, and the Talmud somewhere around 600. But that's much later than what the era that we're looking at. And it's really not clear how much goes back to the first century. Yes, there are times when they will make reference to a rabbi at the time of Jesus in that first century saying whatever. But we don't know how accurate that is. How accurate is it for someone writing 500 or 600 years later to say that this rabbi said such and such? We just don't know. And in fact, Jewish scholars really take that with a grain of salt. They don't necessarily accept that as being completely accurate. But having said that, the Talmud does mention Jesus. He's not mentioned in the Mishnah, but in the Babylonian Talmud, Jesus is mentioned, and he's mentioned in a negative way, which is very interesting, and you can find those texts online, and there's books about that as well. So it is something you can take a look at if you're interested in. So I don't make a big deal of that. I don't say that the Talmud proves that Jesus existed. However, I do point out that there is no reason for us to expect to find first century documents by the rabbis talking about Jesus. So looking at the context there, let's ask the question, how does Jesus do? We looked at what we would expect, and we looked at what we shouldn't expect. How does Jesus do? Well, the Gospels are our best information about Jesus. That's really where we have to start if we're really going to try to understand who he is. Of course, people will try to dismiss the Gospels, but really they are good historical documents that we should take seriously. Then one of the things that I find, especially within Christian apologetics, is a attempt to try to bolster the value of the Gospels by dating them earlier. And so generally within critical scholarship, they accept the Gospels, Mark as being earliest, and they put him sometime in the late 60s, and Matthew and Luke in the 70s, and John perhaps in the 80s. And some Christian apologists are not comfortable with that. They feel that that may be taking away from their historical value, and will try to date the Gospels into the 50s. I would say that it doesn't really matter. Now, that's a discussion that can be had as to what the dating is. But even if the Gospels were dated to the 70s, they are still extremely valuable. They are still very close to the times that are being described within them. Pardon me. And so they definitely have a lot of historical value and should be treated seriously. The Gospels fall into the genre of the ancient biography, and I would recommend Richard Burridge's What Are the Gospels? That is a book that compares the Gospels to other ancient biographies. Now, it's interesting in that in the book by Tom Harper, in The Pagan Christ, he talks about how the Gospels are not a biography in the modern sense. And he says, they're missing all the things that we would want in a biography, the psychological background about why they do what they do, and what's all of their background, and what is the motivation behind them, and what's the inner life of the person. Well, of course, they're not modern biography. They were written 2,000 years ago. What do you expect? We have to compare them with the contemporary genres. And when they're compared with ancient biography, they actually fit very well, and they seem to make sense within that genre. Now, another thing that comes up is when we compare the Gospels, we'll find that there are some variations between them. And some examples would be when Jesus on the cross, the wording on the sign on the cross is slightly different between the Gospels, or how the denial of Peter is described between the Gospels. There's slight variations there, and sometimes Christian apologists get pretty worked up about that. We have to smooth all those things out and make it fit in very nicely. And yet, I'm hesitant to do that, because if each of the four Gospels said the exact same thing in the exact same way, from a historical perspective, we would have one witness. That's it. But because there are some variations there, because there's evidence of different traditions being passed down, that gives us multiple traditions. We have multiple witnesses to the events. And from a historical perspective, that is much more valuable to us. And those slight variations really do not take away from the historical value. I was talking a little bit about Josephus, and I've done some research in comparing a couple of his works. And so he wrote a book called The Antiquities of the Jews, and he wrote another book called The Jewish War. And there's some overlap there where he, in each of those books, is dealing with the same events. And so I compared how they looked, and the differences between them were amazing. And I don't mean that in one account there's 5 people present, and then the second account there's 6 people present. I'm not saying that. It's more like in one account there's 25 people present, and in the next account that he gives there's 2,000 people present. That's the kind of differences that we find, and that's within one author. That's one author writing 2 books and having that kind of variation. When we look at the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and how they fit together there, the ways that they are similar is actually very striking. We find that from a historical perspective, they are very conservative in terms of how they report, and gives us much more confidence than what we find even within other historical sources. And so we shouldn't get too worked up about those things. We should look at them from a historical perspective and say, this is actually something that's very good for us. Now, first of all, I want to say that I'm not denying inerrancy here in any way, but when we're talking about the Jesus myth, and if we're trying to share with a person who is not believing in a historical Jesus, we shouldn't feel the pressure to have to argue for the inerrancy of the Gospels or the New Testament or the Bible. All we have to do is to demonstrate that the Gospels have historical value, that they are documents that are worth taking seriously, and that's really the starting point. And if we can get to the person to understand concepts about inspiration and all the other things that go along with it later on, then that is great. But we shouldn't feel the pressure of having to bring all of those other theological concepts together right at the beginning. Just start with the Gospels as being historically valuable, historically reliable, and let's stick with that. So we've looked at the Gospels. We also have Paul's letters, and it's likely that Paul's letters are earlier than the Gospels, especially if we accept the critical dating of the Gospels. And so we have some very early Christian documents, and these are things that we need to take seriously. And Paul, not only is he writing early, he's sometimes citing some earlier confessions. And so the famous description of the witnesses of the resurrection found in 1 Corinthians 15. That's probably not Paul writing that. He's quoting something earlier in 1 Corinthians 11 when he's quoting the institution of the Last Supper. He's quoting something earlier there. And there's a few other passages where he's quoting earlier confessions. So we're really getting close to the events when we get to Paul's letters. What will often happen is that people will say that Paul never mentions the historical Jesus, that he only proclaims the glorified Christ. Now there's a kernel of truth here, but just a very, very small kernel. There are certain things like the virgin birth. Paul never mentions the virgin birth. He never describes any of the miracles of Jesus, and really doesn't go into the parables or anything like that. He doesn't seem to be that interested in very specific biographical details of Jesus. He's not that interested in that. He's more interested in Christ, who he is now, resurrected, glorified with the Father, and the things that he's doing right now, his second coming. All of those things seem to be where Paul is focusing on. And so we have to be aware that there is that kernel of truth. However, Paul does talk about Jesus. He does give some biographical information. In fact, I've written an article on that, and if you're interested, it's found at on the McMaster Journal of Theology and Ministry. And I just focus on 1 Corinthians, and I give examples of how Paul quotes events in Jesus' life and makes reference to specific teachings of Jesus, and really go into detail just looking at 1 Corinthians. And there's numerous other passages within Paul where he is talking about the historical Jesus. It's not always the glorified Christ. And will people still get a little confused as to why Paul doesn't do that? Why isn't he giving us the information? Well, first of all, first thing you have to realize is Paul's writing epistles. He's not trying to write a gospel. He is writing a letter to churches dealing with specific things. And so today, if I was to write to a church or to a group and to explain something or to address a special issue, I wouldn't feel the pressure to go through and give all the information and give an outline of what Jesus had done and give a summary of his miracles and parables and teachings. I wouldn't feel that need. I would just address the need. And that's exactly what Paul did. But still, we would rather he share a bit more biographical information about Jesus. But to put that into context, read through Paul's letters and look for what he says about himself. Now, there's a number of passages where Paul gives some autobiographical information, but he gives very, very little there. In fact, you can look at the times where he gives biographical information about Jesus, and you can look at the times when he gives autobiographical information about himself, and he seems to save those times for very special cases, when he really wants to pull out the big guns, when he really wants to make a powerful point. That's when he relies on that. He doesn't just throw that stuff out lightly. And just give you an example, we will often speak of Paul in his earlier life as Saul of Tarsus. And I don't know if you realize this, but in his letters, Paul never makes mention of being known as Saul and never makes mention of being from the city of Tarsus. And so if we never had the book of Acts, we would never guess from Paul's letters that he was Saul of Tarsus. That's just autobiographical information he was not interested in giving us. So if he wasn't interested in giving us information about himself, he's not going to give us a whole lot of information about Jesus either. So that just gives a little bit of context there. So the next question we need to ask is about Josephus. That's someone we had talked about, and this is a very touchy subject. And I just want to go through this fairly quickly. Joseph mentions John the Baptist, and it's interesting to look at what Josephus says about John the Baptist, because he gives an independent but compatible tradition. What I mean by that is it's not the same story of John the Baptist that we have in the Gospels, and yet you can really see how it fits together. There's so much that's in common, but it's obviously an independent tradition. And so although he doesn't mention Jesus specifically there, the connection between John the Baptist and Jesus is so close that we really have to take that into account. We also have Josephus mentioning James, the brother of Jesus, and the martyrdom of James, and he specifies that James is the brother of Jesus, and that's an important thing for us to be looking at. But what people are really interested in is the Testamonium Flavianum, and this is where when Josephus gives his description of who Jesus is, and the church has gone back to this, and this is probably one of the reasons why Josephus has been preserved for us. And it's interesting because the Jews did not preserve Josephus. It's always been the church. It's always been Christians that have found Josephus interesting. And this is what the testimony says. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day he appeared to them, restored to life. For the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him, and the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. And Christians have loved this passage. However, there's some problems because we know that Josephus is a Jew. He's not a Messianic Jew. He's not a Christian Jew. Josephus is a traditional Jew. And for him to suggest that Jesus was the Messiah, that Jesus was performing miracles, that Jesus was resurrected, all of those things really seems unlikely. And so what seems to be the case is that there was originally a passage that Josephus had about Jesus, and some well-meaning Christian thought, well, that's nice, but we can do this better. And so he rewrote it, added some things, and tried to improve the passage. And what people who believe in the Jesus myth will say is that this is a complete fabrication, that there originally was nothing at all. But that's really not the case. Josephus scholars have been able to piece together what it probably really looked like. And originally it was something like this. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him, and the tribe of Christians so called after him has still to this day not disappeared. And that passage, when you compare it to other passages in Josephus, where he talks about other people who claim to be the Messiah, other religious leaders, that seems to fit together. And that's likely what originally was there. And Josephus scholars and most New Testament scholars excuse me, would agree that something like this was there originally, that this is not something that was just invented completely out of the blue by Christians, but rather there was an original that was expanded. So we've been looking at the historicity of Jesus, and we find that we have what we would expect. We have the Gospels and Paul, that is, followers of Jesus, writing about Jesus, and we have Josephus making minor mention of Jesus, but not making a big deal of him. That's what we would expect. And that's a reasonable amount of evidence to determine historicity. If we had any other ancient historical figure and we had that kind of evidence, we would never doubt that he existed. It would never enter our mind. And in fact, many other ancient figures have far less evidence, and their evidence are often of poor quality. Most historians, 99% or more, would accept a historical Jesus, even if they were not a Christian. So it doesn't matter if they're atheist, Muslim, Jewish, doesn't matter. Most historians would just accept that Jesus was a historical figure. So I want you to understand what the Mythicists are thinking and try to get a sense of their perspective. First of all, they have little respect for scholarly consensus. As I've been debating Mythicists, I would mention something about, well, like 99% of historians accept that Jesus was a historical figure, or that the consensus by Josephus scholars is that there originally was something there that Josephus said. And they just dismiss the consensus. They will say things like, well, we can think of examples in history where there was a consensus before and someone came around with better evidence and the consensus was overthrown and a new consensus came. And so why should we listen to the consensus? Well, no one really operates like that. Unless you have a reason to not accept the consensus, we just accept that. We might not blindly accept it, but we at least take it seriously when scholars are saying something. We have to take into account. We can't just say, well, all those people with all those PhDs in that field, they're just going to have to be wrong because I read on some internet site that this is the way it is. We really have to take scholarly consensus in a serious way. They are willing to accept fringe scholarship. And I'll give you an example of a recent discussion I had. I was talking about Josephus, and I was saying again that the scholarly consensus is that Josephus originally did say something about Jesus. And they're saying, well, these people don't know what they're talking about. They just rejected that consensus. There's no reason to be listening to that. And they said, we actually like this other book that talks about the Jesus myth and responds to Josephus. And so I just did a little bit of research as to who this person was. And the book was self-published. There's nothing wrong with self-published. I've self-published a couple of books myself. That doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's interesting when you have all of these other books that are perhaps from a university press saying that Josephus is talking about Jesus. Someone self-publishes, you're going to take that into account. Another part of it, this person is not a Josephus scholar. In fact, as I looked at the background, his background was he wrote sci-fi erotica. That's the background that he had, and I thought, okay, well, that doesn't mean he's wrong. He can be an author of erotica and still be correct about Josephus, but you got to take that into account. So these people are willing to give up on the consensus for this other author, and that's just to give you a little picture of what often happens within mythicism. They assume that scholars are corrupted by their presuppositions, or else they're afraid that if they come out and say that Jesus didn't exist, that they might lose their job or whatever, and so they go with the party line. And so that's one of the reasons why they dismiss the consensus. Basically, the methodology they give, they'll come out and say, well, there is absolutely no historical evidence for Jesus. And so you say, well, what about the Gospels? No, we're just going to take that off the table. We reject that. Well, what about Paul? No, we're going to take that off the table. We reject that. Well, what about Josephus? No, we're going to take that off the table. We're going to reject it. Basically, they'll say, once you dismiss the existence, the evidence that exists, then there is no evidence left over. Well, thanks a lot. That's not the way you do any kind of scholarly discussion. You can't start with the evidence and then remove it because it's inconvenient. You have to really wrestle with it. And the other thing that they do is they act as if there's a multitude of first century texts, and for some reason Jesus is not mentioned. And so they seem to think that there's all these Roman letters around, and we have all the records of every person who was crucified and everything that happened in Judea and in Galilee, and we have all these Jewish writings, and everything is available to us, and yet strangely Jesus is just missing. It's so mysterious why he's not talked about. And the truth is we have almost nothing other than the New Testament from the first century. Those things are missing. We have very little in terms of Roman records, very little in terms of Jewish records. And so it's not that Jesus is strangely absent, it's that we have very little that's there, and the little bit that we have, amazingly, Jesus is mentioned. And so that's something we need to take into account. So when we're responding to mythicists, there's just a couple of points here to keep in mind. Challenge them on how they do history. Should we be just as skeptical towards other ancient figures, or is Jesus a special case? And so you can pick different figures from ancient history and say, ask, is this a different way of doing history for Jesus, or should we basically burn most of our ancient history books and just say we just don't know of anything that happened in the far past? And when they begin to mock Christians, these stupid Christians who believe that Jesus really existed, I tend to encourage them to just show up at a university, go into a history department, sit down with a history professor, not a Christian, just a history professor who's sitting there, and say to them, would you agree with me that we really don't have any historical evidence that Jesus existed? And see what they say. And I'm sure that the historian would say, well, no, yeah, there was a Jesus. They might be surprised to find out that there's no, very few historians would accept the mythicist position. Also, I want to challenge their assertions. They'll put forth assertions all the time. And what I will do is demand support. And so, again, the Josephus passage, I will hear often from mythicists. They will say, well, scholars are agreed that it is a complete forgery. And I'll say to them, okay, name me some Josephus scholars. And they will hum and haw, and they will not be able to name one Josephus scholar. The only thing they can do is go to people who already are Jesus myth supporters, and they are the only ones who will accept it as a complete forgery. And those people do not have a background in Josephus studies. And so that's the kind of thing that I do. Demand support. Don't let them just assert things. Expect them to provide some evidence. And try not to lose your patience. Very hard to do, but that's what we need to try. I don't want to go into detail about this, but I'm reminded of something happened to me in grade 9 in high school, where I had an English teacher who took a whole class arguing for the flat earth. And no matter what we said, no matter what evidence we put forward that the earth was round, he was able to turn around and say, well, no, there's a way that you can dismiss that. And I don't think he was really arguing for the flat earth. He was trying to get us to think. But when I think about that experience, it's very much like talking to a Jesus mythicist. No matter what you put forward, they will have a reason to dismiss it. And you just have to be aware that that's what's going on. So the second challenge that we have to deal with is the entire mythical background of it. Because even if we get them to believe that there really is a Jesus of history, they're still going to believe that the Jesus of the Gospels is based on pagan myths. So that's the second challenge we need to bring forward. And this is basically the claim that they put out there. Jesus is simply a Jewish version of a number of other god-men or heroes found in other cultures. They often claim that Jesus was a sun god based on other sun gods. Jesus is seen as belonging to the dying and rising genre of gods or heroes. And the most common comparisons are with Osiris or Horus, Dionysus, and Mithras. And interested, I have Osiris/Horus there because Osiris is the father of Horus, but in some Egyptian myths that distinction is blurred a little bit, and also in some histories, ancient histories, they connect Osiris with Dionysus. And so what mythicists will do is they'll take the myths of Osiris, the myths of Horus, the myths of Dionysus, blend it all together, take from here, take from there, and try to piece that together to show that they're just like Jesus. So these are some of the basic claims that people put out there, that there are these many gods or heroes who had a virgin birth, who had 12 disciples, who were crucified and were resurrected, and often they'll claim that the resurrection took place on the third day. Well, it's expected that they would make this comparison in terms of the virgin birth, because one thing that is true, the early Christians, when they were developing the first Christian art, they actually based their statues and their art of the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus on existing art that was out there of the goddess Isis and baby Horus. That is true, that the early Christians did that. They didn't have anything else to work with, and that was something that they saw as a similarity, and so they were willing to do that. So that's the kernel of truth, but let's look at what was actually going on. And I'll try to go as quickly as possible here because I want to leave some time for some questions, but it's important what we're going to look at. So they're arguing that all these gods were born of virgins. Well, Horus was conceived through sexual intercourse. Now, it was post-mortem in that Osiris was dead at the time, basically in the myth. Isis enables him to have an erection, and she has intercourse with him and becomes impregnated with Horus. And also, Osiris and Isis had been married at this time for quite a while, and so there's no reason to expect that she was a virgin before this, and she certainly wasn't a virgin after this. So how that can be argued that is a virgin birth, I am not sure. Dionysus was conceived through intercourse between Zeus and a mortal woman, so that was not a virgin birth. And Mithras was he emerged from a rock. Well, you know what? That rock was probably a virgin. So I'm going to give them that. We can say that Mithras was virgin born because he emerged from a rock, but very far away from what Jesus was like, how he's described in the Gospels. Other examples that are given are that of Krishna. He definitely had a miraculous birth, but he was the youngest of a number of siblings, and so his mother definitely was not a virgin when he was born. So that's not the same thing either. What about the 12 disciples? Well, that is said over and over again by the Jesus mythicists, and I went through and I read the different myths over and over again. I could never see any description of 12 disciples. Where are they getting this from? And then I was looking at the art, and I noticed that sometimes they would have the 12 signs of the zodiac as part of the artwork. And that is what they're using to say that there was 12 disciples. There's no story, there's no narrative saying that these heroes or gods had 12 disciples. Simply in the artwork, it's used as decoration. And that was extremely common in the ancient world. In fact, we have ancient synagogues that have their floors with a mosaic of the signs of the zodiac. And so it's very, very common. It's not the same thing as 12 disciples. What about the crucifixion? Well, Horus is killed as a child by a scorpion. He's left out in the swamps. Scorpion gets him and he dies. That's not a crucifixion. Osiris is killed by being put in a wooden box. That's not a crucifixion. Dionysus is consumed by the Titans as a very young child. Again, they're claiming that the crucifixion of these different gods is very much like that of Jesus. Circumstances are very, very different. And Mithras never dies. You'll find all kinds of claims on the internet that Mithras is a dying and rising god. There is no description in the narrative of him ever dying or ever rising. So that's something to keep in mind. What about a resurrection? Well, Horus is brought back to life by the prayers of Isis, not on the third day. She finds that he's dead. She prays to one of the other gods, and he brings him back to life. Osiris comes to life, and oftentimes they'll say this is an example of how Jesus was resurrected. And yet, when we look at the myth, Osiris, what happens is the gods acknowledge that he was wrongfully killed by his brother, but his reward is to become the ruler of the underworld. He never does rise. He doesn't come back to the world of the living the way Jesus does at his resurrection. He stays in the underworld. His only reward is that while he's in the underworld, he's allowed to be the ruler of it. Dionysus, his resurrection, he doesn't have a resurrection at all, really. What happens is he's consumed, and Zeus is able to keep his heart, and he attaches the heart to his leg, to Zeus's leg, and from that grows a new baby, is born out of Zeus's leg with the old heart, and that's the new Dionysus. So that's not really a resurrection, and it's not even clear in the myth the connection between the two figures, how much they have in common. Very different from what we find in the resurrection of Jesus. And of course, Mithras, since he never died, he could never have experienced a resurrection. This is something I don't really want to talk too much to you about, but in one of the stories that I read, or one of the books that I read, it talked about Lazarus as being about the resurrection of Osiris. Well, since Osiris really wasn't resurrected, it doesn't make sense, but this shows you how they stretch. They take El, which is Hebrew for God, Asar, which is the Egyptian word for Osiris. Osiris is the Greek version of the name, and Us is the Latin masculine ending. They put that all together, you get El, Asar, Us. Well, what are the chances that someone would have a Hebrew, Egyptian, Latin name? That just does not make sense. Just to give you a little sample of the kind of arguments are being put forward here. Some of the problems with the Jesus myth, excuse me, they use Christian phrases when describing different kinds of events. So they will be describing a miraculous birth, and so they'll call that a virgin birth, even if it isn't a virgin birth, even if it takes place through intercourse, even if the person wasn't a virgin before, they still will call it a virgin birth to try to make that connection with the Christian concept. Same thing with crucifixion, same thing with many other aspects. They will just take an old myth, use Christian terminology, and wow, look at all the similarities that we find. They abuse chronology, so they'll take things like Plutarch's writing about Osiris and Horus, and even though that was written in 120 AD, so post-New Testament, they will argue for that as a source for the Gospels. They'll look at the myths of Mithras and yet not tell you that the text that we have of the story of Mithras and really the time when he was becoming popular was post-New Testament. So it's really hard for us to see how that could be an influence on the Gospels. And of course we have the Gnostic texts where they act as if we have a ton of first century Gnostic texts when really they're not appearing until the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. And so that doesn't tell us much at all about how the New Testament developed. They will cut and paste from many myths. So it's not like they take one story of Osiris or one story of Horus. What they'll say is, if you take this phrase that we found in this pyramid, and you take this word from Plutarch, and you take this sentence from this other historian, and you put that all together, you have the story of Jesus. Well, that's really stretching things. That's not the way you do history. If you want to show that there are true parallels, then you want to compare one text to another and not taking them, cutting and pasting them from different sources. And also they mistake similarity for causation. So yeah, there can be some similarities between the Gospels. There are certain images that are universal. There's talk of light and darkness, life and death, those sorts of things. But that does not mean that one is coming from another. Something could be similar without there being a relationship of causation. So how is Jesus different? Well, Jesus is rooted in history rather than the mythic past. If you were trying to figure out when Mithras lived, you wouldn't be able to find out. You wouldn't be able to know when Horus lived or any of these other gods or heroes, whereas Jesus is definitely rooted in history. He's not Christianity is not a mystery religion. A mystery religion, were secret rituals for you to go through, and we don't even necessarily know what those rituals were. They were so secret. There's nothing like that in Christianity. Salvation was open to all who were willing to believe and put their trust in Jesus. And death and resurrection was a one-time conquering of sin, whereas that genre of dying and rising gods, gods like Baal and other gods of the ancient Near East, those were about the changing of seasons, about acknowledging that there's a time in the world when you can't harvest, and then all of a sudden you're able to harvest. There are times when plants don't grow, there's times when plants do grow, and that's what those myths are about. And there's no indication in the Gospels that the death and resurrection of Jesus was anything like that. And also, the texts that we have in the New Testament came together very suddenly over a short period of time. It was only a matter of a couple of decades that all of these things appeared. That's very different from what we find with the other myths, where we're looking at a period of thousands of years, and it's hard for us even to date some of these things. Very different from what we find with the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament. So that's basically what I have, and that leaves us a little bit of time for questions. And I know I went through this fairly fast, but I hope that what I've presented to you, based on what you've heard from other sources, will give you some thoughts, and perhaps you have something that you want to bring forward. I'd love to talk about this for as long as we have, either about the historical Jesus or the comparison with the pagan myths.
First of all, excuse me, Stephen, it's Paul here again. First of all, just want to thank you for your time on this, and I think we do have a couple of questions, 15 minutes or so. So if folks have a question, maybe you can kind of come up here so that the microphone can catch your question.
Yeah, I very strongly disagree with you about something. I wonder whether you can comment on the fact that C.S. Lewis only became a Christian after he was convinced of the parallels between the Gospels and the great myths. And of course, you get these in C.G. Jung too. He talks about, what is it, mysterious birth, deadly dangers, rescue in the nick of time, precocious development, miraculous deeds, tragic and early ends, symbolical manner of death, post-mortem effects. And C.S. Lewis couldn't make sense of the doctrine of the atonement until he thought of it in terms of the story of Jesus, a history doing for us what we tried to do for ourselves through the myths. So I take this parallel between the Gospels and the great myths to be something very positive. And so I was rather disappointed that you wrote the connection.
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. I have read what C.S. Lewis has said there, and I agree in principle with what he's saying, and I do acknowledge that there are some similarities there. So there are examples of miraculous births. Very few of them are actually virgin births, but there's miraculous births, and there are miracles that have taken place and are described in certain myths. But really, my observations are based on reading the myths. I actually expected, when I read the Egyptian myths, that I would get something very similar to Jesus. I thought when I read about Horus that I would find something like that. I thought when I read about Dionysus or Mithras that I would see those parallels, and they just were not there. And so really C.S. Lewis is just tackling it from a different place. He wasn't interested in looking at it in terms of a historical way. I mean, he's looking at it from a literary perspective and saying, if there are some similarities out there, how do we answer them? How do we understand these similarities? And as you said, he argues that really it's pointing towards the truth that would later appear in Jesus. Where I want to hold the fire to the Jesus mythicists is when they make a claim that the Christians made this up from the pagan myths. Those the specific claims that they're making do not fit the facts. That Horus wasn't virgin born, Mithras was not virgin born, they were not crucified, they were not resurrected, all of those other things. So I want to respond to it more from a historical perspective rather than a literary perspective. But I can see C.S. Lewis's point. I guess I would be more comfortable if I had the opportunity to sit down with C.S. Lewis way back when and say, well, which myths are you talking about? Where are you seeing the similarities? And I would love to know what he was thinking when he was saying those kind of things.
Odin and Attis hung on trees. When I read first about Odin hanging on the tree, I thought that it must be Christian influence. But it isn't. It's the part of the archetype myth, which Gospels also fit, I think. But I won't go on.
Thank you for your question.
Good question.
I know that one of the questions I had is sometimes I've dabbled a little bit in this, and by no means have I anywhere close to as much experience as you have for interacting with the Christ myth. There's usually I run out of patience, as you recommended we don't. But one of the things that I hear often is this whole concept of Josephus and these other references where they do reference Jesus, they weren't contemporary. They didn't live at the same time. Josephus was born after Jesus died. I don't recall that you sort of tackled that a little bit. Maybe you have a few comments on that, whether that's a valid objection, to what extent it's valid, or what your thoughts are.
Well, I had a conversation with a mythicist about that, trying to get a sense of the kind of evidence that they're looking for. So they're saying they want contemporary evidence for the death of Jesus. So I'm thinking, okay, what is valid for contemporary? Yeah, so you don't want it 100 years later, but you can't have it beforehand. You can't have them reporting the death of Jesus beforehand. So is contemporary written on Good Friday? Is that what's contemporary? How far past that are you allowed to be? And so those are some of the discussions that I had with them, and eventually they said that yeah, it can be somewhat later. And in terms of saying, well, wouldn't we like something a little bit earlier than Josephus? Well, sure, that's fine, but where are our other Jewish historians that are around? If we had an example of another Jewish historian from that time, like say if Philo had been based out of Jerusalem rather than Alexandria, if his interest had been in history rather than philosophy, then yeah, we would expect that he would mention something. So, but there's not an available person there that we're missing reference to Jesus. Josephus is the best that we have, and when we look at first century Jewish history, we rely on Josephus. If you read a book that talks about what was happening in Judaism in the first century, basically they are summarizing Josephus. We are taking that stuff as at relatively face value, not just the things that were happening, say, during the Jewish War when Josephus was active, but the things that he's saying that are taking place even earlier in the first century. So that's just the nature of the way history works with us.
Okay, Sek, do you have a question? Yeah, Sek is sort of stand up to hear that. Thank you.
Andrew Pollux in Calgary, Alberta. I guess the rest of us asking questions around here, Calgary. Do you know of any good books in which outstanding scholars on both sides of the issue of, say, whether gospel accounts of Jesus' life are historically accurate, sort of co-authored book? Because, like, my BA is in philosophy. I don't have a PhD, but you have a BA in field. One thing I know about philosophy, it's very easy to cite books where, it's a Christian and atheist co-authored the book, and they're both outstanding scholars. I mean, one example might be William Lane Craig and Quentin Smith. Theism, Atheism, and Big Bang Cosmology, published by Oxford University Press. Each does a half dozen chapters alternating. Christian gives a chapter, atheist gives a chapter. Alvin Flanagan, Michael Tooley, a book, Knowledge of God, been published around 2008, perhaps, by Blackwell, I think is the publisher. Those are outstanding scholars on both sides of the issue who respect each other enough to co-author a scholarly book, alternating chapters, so that you get both sides in the same book, and both are recognized to be outstanding scholars. Do you have people mature enough to do this in the field of biblical scholarship? And if so, could you give us a couple of references? Thank you.
The only example I can think of is the 4 views on the historical Jesus. That's the only one that I know of that that will have some back and forth between recognized scholars. The way it's worked within the mythicist position is that there's very little respect for it in the scholarly world. Most scholars will just dismiss it. They'll just say, you know what, this is just foolishness. We put this in the category of not on an emotional level, but in terms of historical respectability, we put it in the category of Holocaust deniers, or moon landing deniers, and those kind of things. So people just do not take it seriously. I think that that's going to change. because you have Robert Price is certainly writing quite a bit in this area, and Richard Carrier is getting some notice, and I suspect that you're going to see a bit more coming from people like that, and hopefully some scholars are going to be willing to talk about that. But it's hard. So right now, if you want to get something, I would just encourage the 4 views on the historical Jesus. That would probably be the best one that you could find.
Could you mention one of the authors?
Who are the authors of the 4 views? Robert Price was one.
Yeah.
And the other 3, right?
Yeah, just one moment, I'll tell you.
I don't want to put you on the spot.
I'll tell you what, Stephen. Actually, I'll tell you what, Stephen. We can get that after, and I can put the reference and even an Amazon link in the blog entry that this is filed under. So we can correspond later on that one.
Sure, that would be good. It's a very good book, and it's worth looking at. I was actually impressed that they would have that they would include Robert Price in there, and that you would actually get the response from the other 3 scholars. So yeah, it's that whole series. Those 4 view books are worth looking at for that reason.
Okay, well, we don't have any more in this sense. So Stephen, again, thank you very much for your time and for a very informative talk.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun, and I'd encourage you to continue to read in this area. And on my blog, which is 1peter315.wordpress.com, I very often blog on the Jesus myth. And if you look for even that category on my blog, you'll find some of the discussions that I've had. And it is something that on a lay level is growing and is becoming more influential, and I think we need to be prepared to talk about it. And it's not so much the heavy-duty proponents of the theory that we're going to convince. It's going to be the people who are watching us talk to them, the observers. They're the ones that we need to influence. And so if we can respond both with truth and love, I think we can make a difference. So thank you very much for your time, and God bless you in your ministry and your work there in Calgary, and pray that God would continue to use you for His kingdom.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. You as well.
Thank you.